There we go. And I have a quick intro here. Uh, I looked up some numbers and I found out that the Fish and Wildlife Service says that California right now has just about 500,000 acres of wetland, which sounds really impressive at first. It's about two-thirds the size of the state of Rhode Island. But it turns out that's really just a tiny fraction of what we used to have. The same report from the Fish and Wildlife Service says we started out with about 10 times that much wetland in California. Over the last century or more, we've lost about 90% of the wetlands to development, to urbanization, flood control, and overwhelmingly to agriculture. And of course, this has led to big reductions in the populations of many bird species that depend on California wetlands, either for breeding areas or as stopover points during migration. And then you add in the additional stress put on wetlands by the climate change effects of higher temperatures in the last decades and the reduced precipitation. And it's no surprise that wetland birds are one of the groups facing the steepest declines in numbers. Among those species is one of the great California near endemic birds, the tricolored blackbird, one of my favorites, I gotta say. Habitat loss has knocked tricolored blackbird numbers down more than 90% from their historical levels. It's down to a level low enough that tricolored blackbirds are now listed as threatened on the state's endangered species list. But tonight's speaker is working to help save the tricolored blackbird and the other birds that depend on California wetlands. Xerónimo Castañeda is a conservation project manager with Audubon California. He spends a lot of time in California's Central and San Joaquin valleys working on habitat restoration and enhancement and developing management practices for the region's wetlands, farms, and groundwater recharge projects. In addition, he's the lead for California's Tricolored Blackbird Conservation Program in the Central Valley. Xerónimo has a master's degree in natural resource management and wildlife biology from Humboldt State University, and we're delighted to have him join us tonight. Oh, I also want to say thanks to him very much. He's given permission for us to record this, so we'll record this presentation and conversation, and it'll be up on our YouTube channel after the meeting, so you can share it with your friends. As always, we invite your questions after the presentation. You can write your questions in the chat here on Zoom. And now I think let's turn it over to you, Xerónimo Castañeda.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you this evening and share a little bit about the work that I and my colleagues at Audubon California are doing in the Central Valley. Let's see here. Are you, oops, hold on.
Yeah,
I need to share my screen.
Right?
That should be open.
Okay. Let's share screen. And
getting there. We see your desktop. Hey, there it is.
Okay. Well, first, again, I just want to say thank you for inviting me. And I also want to say, wow, because all of the work that you all are doing there with Pasadena Audubon sounds amazing. I mean, just the field days that you're doing, the education, the book release, that sounds really awesome. The artwork on that is amazing. And it's just really exciting to hear, what different folks are doing across the state. I've met with other chapters over the years, and again, it's just really exciting to see how everyone gets involved with their communities and all the great work that they're doing. So huge kudos to you all for what you're doing out there. Yeah, let's jump in. So thank you for the introduction. My name is Xerónimo Castañeda, and I know that Chris just shared a little bit about me with you all, but I'd like to share just a little bit more. I grew up in California native. I grew up in the Bay Area, and one of my favorite places to visit as a child that I can remember was the marshlands, the wetlands around the Bay Area. And I'm not quite sure exactly what drew me to those, but I like to think that it was all the birds. I mean, we always loved going to see the ducks, all the different colors and shapes and sizes of all the shorebirds. It's just so interesting as a little kid to be able to see something so unique. And so it's really, I think it's kind of fun to think that I've almost come full circle to now really working with wetlands and trying to protect them throughout the Central Valley. As an undergraduate student, I attended CSU Monterey Bay. And then for several years, I had an opportunity to do a lot of field work throughout not only California, but I made some excursions to the East Coast and led some banding stations in Maine and coastal Virginia. As Chris mentioned, I made it back to California, where I received a graduate degree in natural resource management from now Cal Poly Humboldt. And then I moved to Sacramento to work with Audubon California. Yeah, and so today my talk is titled Conservation and Drought in the Central Valley. There are many challenges and opportunities that we're facing. And so I just want to share a little bit more about what those might be. So as Chris alluded, the Central Valley landscape was once an expansive mosaic of wetlands and upland habitats, kind of what you can see here. But over the past century, a vast majority of those have been lost, about 90% of those throughout California. And so that's significant. And through urban growth and development, as well as agricultural expansion and conversion of ag lands to non-friendly wildlife crops, there continues to be pressure to convert those wetlands that we have remaining. And now you add climate change, which acts as a multiplier of any negative impacts to the remaining wetlands. And we're in kind of a dire situation. And so now in a time of extended drought that we're seeing today, what are folks like you all and Audubon California and other organizations doing to support birds and wetlands in these times? So again, here's just kind of a snapshot, a visual of what that loss of wetland habitat really looks like. And so on the far left panel, we see just the aerial image of the Central Valley. There's a yellow outline that kind of that focuses on the Central Valley. We see Sacramento in the middle, Fresno, and then Bakersfield a little further to the south. The middle panel there shows the extent of wetland and riparian habitats, floodplains, aquatic habitats throughout the Central Valley pre-1900s. You can see how extensive they were throughout the valley, in particular around Sacramento and north. And then there's a historic Tule Lake down in the southern San Joaquin Valley, which was surrounded by a complex of wetlands and riparian areas. And then as we move to the far right panel, we see that the majority of that is lost. And so that shows that the 90% loss, or about 90% loss throughout the state, and in particular, the Central Valley. And so there are a few strongholds. We see kind of central, just northwest of Fresno. That is what is known as the Grasslands Ecological Area. Some of you may be familiar with that place. That's where we have the San Luis Refuge, the Merced National Wildlife Refuge, and then a complex of private wetlands. And then, of course, we have the Delta area here. And then as you move further north, we have some more national wildlife refuges and the Sacramento River. And the situation down in the south does not look so great. And the gray area that has taken over all of those wetlands is, again, agriculture and urban development. So one of the first and kind of most obvious things that someone might do when they're faced with that is to create habitat for birds. And so how do we do that? And so through a proven track record of implementing science-based approaches to conservation that include our work with rice growers in the Sacramento Valley, to provide overwintering habitat for birds. The Migratory Bird Conservation Partnership, which includes Audubon, the Nature Conservancy, and Point Blue Conservation Science, was successful this past year in securing funds to roll out a emergency drought relief program to benefit waterbirds throughout the Central Valley. And so, again, because we have such a proven track record working collaboratively across not only our groups, but with agencies and private landowners, we were tapped to implement this program across the entire Central Valley. So Sacramento Valley, all from Redding all the way south to Bakersfield. And so this program, the goal of it is to incentivize landowners to create either wildlife-friendly habitat through alternative management practices on their farms, or to manage their wetlands in a way that benefits more than just single species. A lot of these wetlands historically are managed for ducks. And so again, this partnership has come together under kind of the name of Bird Returns to really scale up the efforts that have been occurring over the last decade in the Sacramento Valley, working with rice growers to create surrogate wetland habitat and improve native wetlands, and to scale that up and implement that across the whole valley. And so this year we were able to offer 4 programs in 3 geographies. So again, the Sacramento Valley, the Delta, and then areas south of the Delta. And the programs were for creating winter habitat that was otherwise not going to be present across the landscape, winter wetland habitat, excuse me. And then also currently we are offering a program or we're executing a program that is creating migratory or wetland habitat for migratory shorebirds. And so, as I briefly mentioned, a lot of the remaining wetlands across the valley are managed primarily for ducks. So managed for duck hunters. A lot of the refuges are that way, and then a lot of the majority of the private wetlands across the state are managed that way as well. And so the traditional management doesn't really offer much to these other species of waterbirds. And so the partnership, including Audubon, we saw this opportunity to work with innovative, forward-thinking landowners and to develop alternative wetland management practices that could benefit a broader suite of species. And of course, ducks were well taken care of, and the most logical direction to move would be to focus on shorebirds. And so while they can be lumped into this broader waterbird category along with ducks and geese, because they all need water for their habitat, shorebirds are much more specific in their habitat requirements. And so here we see some little peeps that require shallow depth water so they can have access to the substrate below the mud. But then we also have longer leg waders that require maybe a little deeper water. And so our program, again, worked with these landowners to develop alternative management practices to create wetlands, to manage these wetlands in a way that will benefit these other species. And so this is kind of an example of what we're seeing on the landscape traditionally on the left-hand side versus when we implement our program on the right-hand side. And so it's kind of a no-brainer. when the wetlands are managed traditionally for ducks and waterfowl, they pull the water off in late February or early March. And that is the time when it's really needed the most for migratory shorebirds. So the photo on the right is a property that was enrolled in this particular program. We work with that landowner to ensure there's fully flooded on their wetland by the beginning of April. And then over that month, we work with them to do a staged drawdown of the water, bringing the water off, creating variable water depth habitat, exposing mudflats that can provide a diverse amount of different habitat across the landscape. And so this is an aerial image of one of those wetland ponds that was enrolled, and this was taken just last week. So at the beginning of April, this pond was completely full, and over the last couple of weeks, we've worked with that landowner to draw the water down. And so you can see that there's some exposed mud flats there in the middle and kind of on the north side and lower left of the image, but there's still plenty of water to support some of those other birds that need deeper water. And this photo was taken the same day that other photo was taken. And so we can see the response from the birds is immense. Our field biologist, who is counting the birds out there this year across the different ponds that enrolled, was literally dumbfounded by how many, and speechless by how many birds he was seeing and the diversity of birds that he is seeing in these wetlands. He has spent most of his time working in the Sacramento Valley, and so he's used to seeing kind of that diversity and that community of birds up there, and didn't really think that the number and the species richness could be so great down in the Southern Valley. And so it was pretty exciting to hear him and how excited he was to experience this. And so this program, as I mentioned, it was a drought relief program, started this year, and we were fortunate enough to have funding for the next few years. And the hope is that by demonstrating the need for this program, the willingness of landowners across the state, and a positive bird response, that we will be able to secure longer term funding from the state and from other funders to ensure that we can maintain this program and provide this critical habitat during the spring migratory period. But of course, all of this relies and needs water to implement. And so water is essential to everything we do, not only for the birds and the wetlands, but for agriculture, for people drinking water, bathing, cleaning, that sort of thing. And so, being faced with climate change and extended droughts every handful of years, Audubon has really immersed itself into the world of water, so to speak, and has become a leader, especially in groundwater work across the Central Valley. And so in this work, we really strive to ensure that water, groundwater, and any other sources of water remains a viable option, not only for wetland habitat and agriculture, but for communities as well. And so through our work, we look to secure and maintain existing water resources needed to support any remaining critical habitat. But then we also work on building our network and a framework to ensure future water resources and management decisions appropriately account for water needs of habitat as well as create resilience in the water system to have positive impacts for, again, not only wildlife, but communities also. And so you may all be aware, I mean, this is kind of like a common news headline that we see in California. Water is scarce, and farmers are working in innovative ways to store water underground. And so this particular farmer here is in Tulare County, and he's standing in a groundwater recharge basin. And so again, Audubon is seeing this opportunity or seeing this challenge as an opportunity to work with non-traditional partners like the farmer in the previous image, and try to think creatively to ensure that as water gets put into the ground, when it's then extracted, it can be used to help birds above the ground. And so one of the things that I have been working on closely with some of my colleagues is the development of and design of wildlife-friendly groundwater recharge basins. And so a lot of folks throughout the valley during years and times of surplus or flooding, they want to capture that water, and instead of putting it in a reservoir behind a dam, we are proposing that you create, essentially you're creating temporary wetlands in areas that have good percolation rates to allow water to go into the underground aquifers. And so, as you put water on the landscape, as we saw in those previous images, it doesn't take a lot for birds to respond, but just imagine if we're able to design these groundwater recharge basins and create a little more complexity to them in terms of adding wetland type vegetation or some upland vegetation, that sort of thing. Installing small islands in some of these areas so when they are flooded, birds can stay protected from any predators. And so this has really been something that Audubon is championing, and we are getting some positive feedback from a lot of water districts and farmers that want to practice this and implement these, because they realize that we have to share the water, and the best way to do it is try to develop these multi-benefit type projects. And even though we are working hard on developing those projects with private landowners, we are still pushing really hard to ensure that the existing wetlands, in particular our national wildlife refuges, receive the water that is owed to them. And so unfortunately, we have not been doing such a great job at that. And this map kind of demonstrates that. So all the circles represent national wildlife refuges throughout the Central Valley. The colors from red to green represent that relative amount of water that is distributed to those from their assigned allotment. And so green means that they're receiving a good proportion of the water that is legally supposed to be obligated to them. And the red and orange and yellow mean that water is not making it there for some reason. And so, again, we are working to try to ensure that this water that is owed to these refuges makes it there, and really put pressure on the agencies that are supposed to be enforcing this, and working with local agencies to figure out ways and alternatives to get water to the places that it needs to be. And of course, we can't do any of this without partnerships. This is just a small example of some of the partners that I work with on a pretty close basis. We have the Natural Resource Conservation Service, Western United Dairies, I mentioned Point Blue and the Nature Conservancy, and then of course, California Fish and Wildlife and Fish and Wildlife Service, among others. And so now to transition to a species that really requires wetlands and has been threatened even more so by the loss of those wetlands. And so a lot of the work that I do on those other projects, I think of ways, to manage them or to implement those types of projects that could also benefit this iconic species, the tricolored blackbird. And so the Tricolored Blackbird program for Audubon was really started kind of as a grassroots program where my predecessors, they really would just go out on the landscape and when they would find birds, they would go start knocking on doors. And that had some good success to it, being able to have that one-on-one conversation with farmers and other landowners and sharing that this bird is iconic. It's near endemic to California, and unless it's protected, it may become extinct. And so that worked for a little while, but as the situation became more and more dire for the tricolored blackbird because of extended drought, and continuing loss of remaining wetlands, Audubon and some other organizations came together and said, we need to find a solution, or at least a process that makes this a little more official. And so we recognized that we needed to reach outside of our basic network of working with other environmental organizations, and we reached across to the dairy community. And together we formed the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, which is funded by the Natural Resource Conservation Service. And our charge was to develop a program that was just more effective at doing outreach, implementing habitat restoration projects, and protecting the most at-risk colonies. And so one of the things that makes tricolored blackbirds very unique is that they're the last land-based colonial bird in California or in North America. And so during the breeding season, unlike red-winged blackbirds, tricolored blackbirds form these massive colonies, and that makes them particularly susceptible to any type of disturbance. Whether it's people walking through a field or through a wetland area, or tractors moving around the farm or something like that. When you have a nesting colony of 10,000 birds, a disturbance like that could cause those birds to abandon that colony, which has pretty significant negative impacts to the population. So some brief, just looking at the tricolored blackbirds versus red-winged blackbirds. If you're not completely familiar with the differences, the males here, we can see that the key distinguishing marker is the white bar under the red shoulder on the tricolors versus the more yellowish under the red shoulder of the red-winged blackbird. And here's an image of both male and female tricolors in the field. And then females are a little more challenging to differentiate. But overall, we see that tricolored blackbird females tend to be a little bit darker and not as heavily streaked as female red-winged blackbirds. But what really, again, what really kind of sets them apart is when they form those large colonies, large flocks. And so during the breeding season, if you're out and about birding and you happen to see a flock of blackbirds, several dozen to several hundred or thousand, the likelihood that those are tricolored blackbirds is pretty high. Because during the nesting season, those other species like red-winged blackbirds or Brewer's blackbirds, they separate out to form their territories, and they're not as communal or colonial as the tricolored blackbirds. And so let's see. So the statewide survey, many of you may have heard or even participated in this this past weekend. The statewide survey is an effort that kind of happened partially pre-2008, but really in 2008 was kind of the big push to coordinate and organize that. And the reason was because we were seeing birds. The thought was that more and more birds were being lost to colony destruction and disturbance and that sort of thing. And so this particular graph shows the year on the x-axis and then the number of birds observed during those statewide surveys on the y-axis. And so we see in 2008 that the population from the statewide survey was estimated at about 400,000. And then as we go over the years, we see that population steadily declining. And it is of note that in 2014 was the turning point, in a sense, I would like to think, because that was the beginning of that partnership that I had mentioned with the dairy community, where we formed that regional conservation partnership program to really focus our efforts and put a more coordinated effort into doing that outreach and identifying landowners and protecting the most at-risk colonies. And so after 2014, there was one statewide survey. In 2017, we can see there's a slight increase. We can't necessarily say that the population is rebounding, but it's hopeful, I guess. At least it hasn't declined. The statewide survey was supposed to happen in 2020, but for obvious reasons, it did not. And then it got pushed back until this year. And so if you were fortunate enough to have participated, thank you for that. You know, it's a huge undertaking, a huge coordination effort by Bob Meese and some others, you know, to find county coordinators and to get all the people involved. And so hopefully we can gather that information, and the data will come in the next couple of weeks, and we can add another data point to this graph here. And hopefully it shows an increase. And so kind of to give you, I guess, a snapshot of all the places that people visit, all the red dots represent survey locations throughout the state. And so why is the statewide survey important? You know, it was able to show as evidence that the population was in steep decline. The statewide survey provided support for the eventual listing of the tricolored blackbird to California's Endangered Species Act. And it really has allowed us to track in a standard way the response of the population, not only before the partnership, but hopefully after the partnership, and the efforts that we have undertaken since the development of the partnership in 2014. And so what we're seeing here is a nest in a wetland. We could see how the nest forms around the tules. The tules provide this really dense structure and habitat to shield the nest from any predators from above or below, as well as provides good concealment. Here we see birds in a wetland in their native habitat. This is a colony, nesting colony down in Kern County. The kind of flights that you see here in this video are pretty characteristic of the tricolored blackbirds coming back to the colony after they've been foraging. So this is what we're really striving for, through all those different programs that I was mentioning earlier in the talk, and then our work in water, working to develop new wetlands or ensure that water gets to the remaining wetland areas throughout the state. But the challenge is that these birds, because of the loss of those wetlands, they have started nesting in dairy silage fields. And so this nest that we see here, it was built in a grain field. And so we can see how it looks very similar to that previous picture. The grain fields provide this dense habitat structure, good cover from above and below. But the challenge, and so here's actually an image, short video of birds nesting in a silage field. So again, we see the same type of flights. The habitat looks the same. It's a little more green in this image, but it provides that same type of structure that the birds need to nest. The birds particularly focus in areas where there are a lot of dairies. And so this map shows not only where the colonies are, so all the colored dots, but also where dairies are concentrated. And so because of that, and coinciding with the loss of wetlands, we have a lot more birds nesting in those silage fields. And unfortunately, the nesting period coincides with the timing of harvest of those fields. And so there's a direct conflict with the farmers when a colony establishes in one of those fields. And so luckily for us, we have developed that partnership over the last 6+ years. That partnership has really grown. We've formed long-lasting friendships and relationships with our dairy partners. So Western United Dairies, Dairy Cares, the Farm Bureau, and we are moving in lockstep, moving forward to develop our program to protect the tricolored blackbirds. And so firstly, we identified the highest at-risk colonies that are nesting in silage fields. And through our partnerships with the dairy community, we're able to connect with those producers almost immediately, which is awesome. While we're doing that, during the nesting season, we're working to develop longer-term solutions and implement pilot projects. Some of those solutions revolve around securing long-term funding to protect these colonies that are nesting in silage fields, but then also funding to develop wetlands. And then obviously outreach and education is always important, not only to the dairy community, but to the general public. And so by doing that, we have really seen that producers are coming forward on their own. And so for us, that's a win, because previously, before all of our outreach and education efforts, they would kind of plead innocence and they would not report the birds. And so having a dairy producer call you up and say, hey, I've got tricolored blackbirds is pretty huge. And then again, as I mentioned, habitat restoration and enhancement is another focus of this partnership. And so to date, through this partnership, we've protected over 820,000 nesting birds. And so that's pretty awesome. That is not the population number. That's just the number that we estimate kind of from year to year. We combine all of those numbers and get that 820,000. This has been across 73 colonies, from Bakersfield, south of Bakersfield, all the way up to north of Sacramento. And so far, we've been able to enhance over 100 acres of wetland habitat in the areas that it's needed the most. And so in Kern County and Merced County. And this year in 2020, the number of colonies so far detected and protected is 8, I believe. And the number of birds estimated, it's a little bit lower than we expected. It's around 100,000. But a lot of our counts have been after the birds have already established colonies, and a lot of them have started incubating, and so we're not able to count the full number of birds. So we suspect that the number is a lot higher, but again, we haven't been able to count all of them since they're sitting on nests. And even though we've been pretty successful in our partnership with the dairy community, we're still faced with these continuing challenges of extended drought, the loss of 90 to 95% of Central Valley wetlands, and the pressure of continued land conversion to high value crops like almonds and walnuts and pistachios, but then also to urban development. And then, as I spoke to earlier in the talk, just water availability, getting water to those existing wetlands, and then having access to water and having to essentially compete with other water interests like agriculture. But we, with the help of everybody, like you all and all the volunteers who participated in the statewide survey, we're pushing forward, and we have a lot of support. We built this strong partnership over the last 6 years with our dairy partners and the Natural Resource Conservation Service, and we have a vision where we can figure out a long-term solution to not only protect the birds, but to support all the dairy producers that host the birds on their farms. So we're going to continue to promote multi-benefit land use to provide not only nesting habitat, but foraging opportunities for nesting tricolored blackbirds, develop new partnerships beyond the dairy community. And so look to other agricultural interests and other agencies to participate in finding a solution. One thing that I am particularly excited about is the use of new technology. It sounds like their next month's talk, they'll mention something about putting up a radio tower to track some birds. And so that's a technology that has been talked about in our partnership to use to try to figure out how tricolored blackbirds are using the landscape, where they're going to forage, that sort of thing. And then also maybe even use drones to kind of get a better snapshot of the extent of nesting colonies and how large they actually are in some of these areas. And then of course, you can't beat developing wetland as a solution. And so continuing that fight and continuing to find the resources needed to create and enhance wetland habitat. And then just further support the dairy producers who are protecting nesting colonies on their farms. And with that, I'd like to say thank you again for inviting me to speak with you today. And I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much for this. Now, just a reminder to everyone, please, if you have questions, go ahead and throw them in the chat here in Zoom. One question that came in that I was curious about as well is so if I'm a dairy farmer, what exactly do I do different to help out the tricolored blackbirds on my land? Do I just harvest the crop later?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's not, honestly, that's one of the biggest challenges is that it's there's not really much that they can do other than delay the harvest and harvest after the birds have dispersed from the fields. And so that is what we work with them to do. And so through our program, we work with that producer. We delineate the extent of the colony in their field. And in many cases, because it doesn't cover a large enough area of the field, we actually put up markers around the colony with a buffer to ensure that the farmers and their workers know kind of not to disturb that area. And if it's possible, we allow for them to harvest the area outside of that boundary, and then just maintain that substrate for those birds to complete their nesting cycle. And so the challenge there for the producer is that they're trying to grow the crop for optimal nutritional value for their cows.
Yeah.
And so as they delay the harvest, depending on how long it's delayed, that value goes down. And so then we work with them to try to provide some financial assistance as well, so that they can find replacement feed for their cows, so they're not at a complete loss.
I see. And where does that money come from? Is that coming from Audubon, or are there state or federal funds that can cover that?
Yeah, so that comes from the federal side through the Natural Resource Conservation Service. And so NRCS, they have various programs, incentive type programs, conservation programs, where they work with different types of landowners to implement a wide array of different conservation practices. One of them is to delay harvest for wildlife. And so there are other instances where other species will nest in fields, and NRCS works with them to do the same thing that they do for tricolored blackbirds. And so there's a set amount of there's a set rate that goes along with that particular practice, and so that gets offered to those producers through that. In past years, the state has stepped in with some funds to support that, and we are working with them to try to boost that payment rate a little bit this year because of supply chain issues, increased gas prices, that sort of thing. It's really increased the cost for producers, and so we recognize the challenge that they're facing. Even though it's they're legally obligated to protect the bird, we want to be able to provide them some support and not put them out completely.
Right. So it sounds like, am I correct that the money that they get doesn't fully make up the difference, doesn't make up the loss in that they're incurring, or is it pretty much a wash? They pretty much come out even.
In some years they come out a little bit on top. In most years they come out at a loss. Okay. Yeah, and so it's not the most popular program, but they feel it's better than not receiving anything at all.
Right. Yeah. Do you have a sense of you kind of implied that this is kind of catching on among dairy farmers? Is adoption pretty universal, or there's still a lot of farmers out there that say, the hell with the birds, I'm mowing my silage on the perfect day for me?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, because especially like this year, the payment rate is less than 50% of cost, and so it's a really tough kind of situation for those folks. The bird is protected under CISA, and so if we know about it, if the state knows about it, then if they mowed them down, they would be in big trouble.
I see.
And so they know that. Mm-hmm. And so they won't do that, hopefully. But they still don't really, they make it hard for us to work with them. They will work with us, but in tough situations, they make it hard for us.
Right. I understand.
Yeah.
I'm also curious about you would, if you didn't mention explicitly, one of your slides talked about the cooperation you have with the rice farmers in the area. What do they do to help blackbirds?
The rice farmers, well, so the majority of rice is grown in the Sacramento Valley. I would say probably 98%, 99%. And in part because they have more water access up there. I don't think they necessarily do anything specific for tricolored blackbirds. I think because rice is grown in flooded fields, I mean, it provides a surrogate wetland habitat. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, the structure of the rice is not dense enough. It doesn't provide the same type of structure as tules or this grain that is grown on dairy farms to support a nesting colony. But where the rice is beneficial to them, it provides foraging opportunity, which is pretty significant, especially because we're seeing a lot more fields and agricultural operations switching to trees, putting in almond trees and walnuts and stuff like that.
Right.
So, yeah.
We had a question about just kind of like the 12-month cycle of the tricolored blackbirds? Where are they when it's not breeding season and they're not in these huge flocks? Do they migrate out of the state? Do they disperse throughout the state? Are they still concentrated together?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we're still learning about that. But we do know that they will congregate with other blackbirds. So they then form these large mixed flocks with red-winged blackbirds, brewer's blackbirds, yellow-headed blackbirds. I think those are all the blackbirds. Yeah, and so you'll see them in these massive mixed flocks around, and they'll kind of hang around where they nest in the general regions, but they also will move. They'll move around. They don't go to Mexico or anything, or Central America. And they're, the birds that do extend up into Washington or Oregon, they will definitely come down a little bit. But for the most part, I would consider them resident birds throughout most of the range.
Okay. Okay, pretty good. While you were speaking, I fired up eBird and I saw that there was a tricolored blackbird 10 days ago at Sepulveda Basin. So that's probably the if anyone here wants to go see a tricolored blackbird, that's the closest one to us.
Cool.
Yeah, it's been around
Yeah.
lately. Oh, actually, Luke Tiller, our field trip leader, just posted that one of the few places for tricolored blackbirds in Los Angeles County is a place called Holiday Lake, which is in the western Antelope Valley. He says the lake has not been filled with water the last couple of years, and so the birds haven't bred there. Do you have any suggestions on finding out what happened to that and how we might get water back there? Is that in your range, or is that a little too far south for you?
Yeah, that is. I mean, that is a site that has been on my radar, and I have kind of talked to some folks about, at Audubon, kind of what the deal is there. My understanding is that whoever manages it, when they manage it kind of opportunistically, as there is water available. And I think the last time that it was flooded for multiple years, there was a contract agreement for them to do that. And so because that ended, then it was just too expensive, and there's not a plethora of water in that region to flood it.
I see.
And that's been a problem with a lot of our habitat type projects. We are able to work with some landowners in Kern County and Tulare County, but just because it's so uncertain with the availability of water and the cost, I mean, they only ever want to do short-term agreements, and so we can only ever get a few years.
And how's the water looking this year? I'm guessing it's probably not that great.
No, it's bad.
Yeah.
I will say that much. Yeah.
Yeah. We had a question here about the manure that tricolored blackbirds produce when they're in these huge breeding colonies. Does that enrich the soil to a significant extent? Does it actually help dairy farmers out?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that is something that we have talked about as a partnership, and in the Tricolored Blackbird working group, there's a few folks who are kind of curious about that. I would imagine so, to a degree. But, most of that excrement ends up on the foliage of the grain itself, and so it doesn't really make it down into the soil.
Right. And we don't have any rain to wash, and we don't get rain to wash it down into the soil.
Yeah. So I would probably say not so much. Maybe in areas where they're foraging, so they're foraging in like alfalfa fields or like pastures or some other fields that have lower vegetation where they can actually get down onto the ground. So I would think so. I mean, I don't know if it's enough to really quantify, or it's so kind of patchy that I don't know if it would be that much of an incentive for landowners. I mean, the one thing that that some people argue may be a greater benefit is them foraging and pulling off insects and that sort of thing from the crops.
Right, acting as pesticide agents.
Yeah.
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 Gotcha. Yeah. We have a question about I guess one of the universal enemies to the tricolored blackbird, the almond farmers. Question is, does the state of California do anything to discourage farmers from planting more almond groves and other crops that require so much water? Is there any sort of incentive to to stop doing that?
In short, no. I mean, that's kind of like, I mean, I guess that's like the capitalist society that we live in, right? It's kind of, that would be my thought, but the landowners have the right to do what they would like to do on their farm, on their properties, and so I think it might change because of the extensive drought. A lot of trees in the valley are being pulled out, and so the almonds are not as lucrative as they once were. So maybe in the next 5-10 years, we might see a shift away from that into something that's a little more seasonal, annual crops sort of thing.
I see. Yeah. We have a quick comment back about Holiday Lake from Dave Weesoff, who said that he says the local water district wanted a huge amount of money to pump the water into the region, far beyond what anyone thought was, reasonable to pay. So there you go. That's part of the problem there. I think I have one final question for you, and that is where, if you could tell us to drive north one place to see one of the huge tricolored blackbird flocks, where would you send us? Where should we get in the car and go to?
Let's see. I would say, well, there's a colony southwest of Bakersfield, like 20 minutes.
Okay.
It is on a farm, but you can see it from the road. But those birds are likely feeding young, so they might not be there for very much longer. And that's probably the case. That's the case for a lot of the colonies right now in that region. Because it's been so dry, they have started nesting a lot sooner than they typically do, and so we're coming into the time where they're about to leave. They've either fledged young and they're feeding them to get them to that point where they can disperse and fly on their own, or they're going to fledge young pretty soon here.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, that whole kind of like southwest Bakersfield, around the Kern Refuge, there's like a handful of areas around there where there are birds on farms, and some wetlands. But yeah, if you drive around, that kind of area, you'll probably run into some tricolored blackbirds.
Okay. Well, I appreciate the answers, and once again, thank you so much for taking the time to educate us all about the tricolored blackbirds and all the other work that California Audubon's doing to help get some wetlands back and save the ones we have. And thank you so much. We appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it. And if folks have other questions, feel free to shoot me an email.
Okay, I appreciate it. Thank you so much. And a reminder to everyone, we'll have this talk up in a few days up on our YouTube channel. And Laura, back to you.
Thanks, Chris. That was an amazing presentation. Thank you for sharing that. Now we'd like to hear good news. You know, there's not enough of it. So we really appreciate that. And everybody, thanks for coming. And I hope to see you in May at our talk on Bear Divide. And go out and count some birds this weekend. Do birdathon. Join us.
Yeah.
Take care, everybody.
Good night, all.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.